Music in Dwarf Fortress is really cool, but also really complicated. Procedural instruments are varied and interesting, but also require 5 different workshops to build. Songs are packed with history and music theory, but tie my brain into knots when I'm trying to figure out what kind of song the farmers in the local borough would like to hear. And musical skills are highly specialized, which makes musicians more interesting, but also makes it more annoying when you're the greatest Erdem player the world has ever known, and don't have any songs that require the Erdem in your civilization's musical lexicon. These systems stack on top of one another to make the musical Voltron of Dwarf Fortress really interesting, but also kind of intimidating, which means that I generally just ignore it. It just feels like one of those things in Dwarf Fortress you have to devote a fortress to fully appreciate, like unicorn ranching, or living as a hermit. Which is why this is my first video in my musical fortress project. For the next month or so, I'll be treating music as something to be celebrated, rather than as a sign of excess happiness that needs to be crushed out of my dwarves with a new horrifying project, like I usually do. So in this video, I'll be cramming 80 dwarves into a fortress that's too small, cooking some sand, and stealing a notable old musical artifact that's been hanging out in my world for the past 9 months. But first things first, my dwarves needed somewhere to sleep. I embarked in a patch of woods that seemed somewhat out of the way of the rest of my world, and named my new fortress Song Scholars, so that migrants would know what was expected of them the moment they picked up the travel itinerary. Once we arrived, I started out my fortress plan by digging down until I hit the first cavern. I wanted to build a fortress that looked like a tower, just underground, and based on the cavern location, I had 7 layers of stone to work with, between the surface and the cavern. The surface layer was turned into a nice foyer for the fortress, and then turned into workshop overflow once I realized there were instrument-producing workshops that I didn't have below on my workshop floor, which was more of a general keep the fortress running kind of floor. Below that, I built a dormitory floor to promote bonding, and also to be really lazy. Next floor down, I built a temple/hospital floor, which I hoped would serve as musical inspiration for my new musicians, either for religious hymns or haunting deathly dirges, depending on which room the songwriter found themselves in. Further down still was the guild hall/offices floor, because even in a musical fortress, you can't escape the need to support your farmers and build up some bureaucracy. Then, below that, I built a library that I thought would serve as an adequate punishment zone for misbehaving performers. Then, on the 6th level down, we have the tavern, where my dwarves have an opportunity to actualize the mission statement of this fortress. And finally, on the bottom floor was the dining hall, because I wasn't interested in taking the starving artist trope literally enough to remove it. All in all, it was a pretty nice place that made my dwarves pretty happy, which seemed good if I wanted them to flourish artistically, and they really should be grateful for having a set place to ply their trade. Life on the road is pretty rough for a musician. You just never know when you'll turn a corner and get paralyzed by a cave spider, or wander into a lair and find a musically disinterested night creature waiting to tear you apart. But even with a fortress in place, there would be no way for my dwarves to achieve the goals I had laid out for them if I didn't get them some instruments to play. Fortunately, the first strange mood of the fortress had just so happened to produce an artifact Zazouk, which was some type of drum instrument, and which seemed like a good omen for the fortress. With 1 jewel in the crown of Song Scholars, I could move on to producing low-quality knockoffs of the other instruments my civilization had created, which meant collecting sand for glass Athnir cases and Dubmin frames, tanning some leather for Zuril and Jurust components, and cooking up some clay Sagoon cases and cast blowpipes. Which feels like gibberish to say, and certainly felt like gibberish when I was trying to remember the names of all the instruments and their components while putting them together. It was as if each component was as slippery as an eel, and each time I closed a workshop menu, my eel pond was rendered empty, so to speak. Despite my struggles, I did eventually manage to build a good chunk of medium-quality instruments for my dwarves to enjoy, all of which got stocked in the tavern chests, along with some elven instruments I happened to pick up while trading. But while my dwarves now had a good base of instruments to work with to produce actual music, I wasn't happy with just one artifact instrument in my fortress. If we were going to be the definitive musical fortress of this world, then I wanted a second jewel for our crown. The artifact nazush that had been forged in my first fortress of this world nearly 9 months ago. According to the game, and the knowledge available to my civilization, the nazush was still residing in that first fortress, but I thought I knew better. Back at that time, wannabe musicians from across the world had flocked to First Embraced to steal my nazush, which led me to building a vault to keep it safe. But then, in my Tavern Fortress, I had happened upon a visitor holding my prized nazush in her inventory, and so I had reclaimed it. It was my belief that the nazush was still in Cavernbar, lying dormant for the past 100 years. And my belief was proven correct when my friendly raiding party returned with it in their possession. As it was brought into the tavern, I considered making it a decorative centerpiece, but I knew it was too good of an instrument to spend its time sitting on the wall not being played. What I wanted was for some unlucky dwarf to pick it up, strum its cursed strings, and be immediately attacked for holding the most valuable instrument in my world. But I would apparently have to wait a while for that, because the first performers of my fortress were less interested in singing songs and playing ditties than they were in telling stories to people. Other than one terrible performance they put on, where they imitated one of the only instruments I hadn't bothered to make, rather than pick up and play one of the many I had, they were content to just spend their days chatting away. But this fortress is still young, and there will be plenty of opportunities to teach my dwarves to sing. The important thing for now is that my prized nazush is back in the world and now residing in a proper home. Thanks for watching, an extra thank you to those of you who support me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.